He said it quietly. That's what made it worse. Not a shout, not a fist against the counter, just 4 words delivered in the same, even tone a man might use to comment on the weather, spoken across a kitchen island while my mother ran a bath upstairs, unaware that her new husband had just looked her son in the eye and said, "You should be careful." Most threats announce themselves. This one came dressed as concern, and that quiet, careful delivery told me everything about the kind of man I was dealing with. He wasn't losing control. He was showing me he already had all of it. What he didn't know, standing there with a glass of scotch he hadn't earned in a house he didn't build, was that he'd just threatened someone trained to read a room the way most people read a sentence. Instantly, instinctively, for structure and threat. He saw a 28-year-old in a faded sweatshirt, home on leave, soft around the edges. He had no idea he was looking at a Navy SEAL who understood, better than almost anyone he'd ever manipulated, that the most dangerous person in a room is rarely the loudest. 7 months earlier, my mother had introduced me to Gerald Ashford over a laggy video call from a barracks common room on the other side of the world. She'd met him at a charity gala for a children's hospital foundation, the kind of event that draws exactly the sort of well-dressed men who know how to find a grieving widow's soft spot and stand in it. 56, a self-described independent financial consultant, a title vague enough to mean anything. He told a story about a first marriage that shifted slightly depending on who was listening. My mother, 6,000 miles from me and drowning quietly in a grief I couldn't see from that distance, called him different, patient, a man who listened. For months later, she married him in a courthouse ceremony I learned about after the fact. The house I walked into on leave looked unchanged, except that the photographs of my father had migrated, one by one, to a hallway nobody used. Gerald's handshake lasted half a second too long. He asked about my work with air quotes, called me one of the boys in uniform in a tone that managed both compliment and dismissal, and inside 20 minutes asked how long I'd be staying. Innocent question. Except a man doesn't ask a departure date unless he's already building a schedule around it. I didn't confront him. I watched. That's the first thing 4 years of training rewires in you. The instinct to gather before you act. I clocked the locked filing cabinet in the office my mother no longer entered without knocking. I clocked the second phone that lived exclusively in his jacket pocket, even at the dinner table, never on the counter, never charging in a visible outlet. I clocked how he tensed, just slightly, at the base of his jaw, whenever my mother said my father's name, and how he'd redirect the conversation within 4 or 5 seconds every time, smooth enough that she never noticed the pattern, obvious enough that I couldn't miss it. On the third night, I ran a small test. Nothing dramatic, the kind of low-cost probe you use on an unverified subject when you want data without tipping your hand. I mentioned, casually, over dinner, that I need to swing by the bank in the morning to check on some paperwork of my mother's, a total fabrication. Gerald's fork paused for less than a second. He recovered fast, asked which bank, offered to drive me himself. I said I'd manage. That night, from the guest room window, I watched his car leave the driveway at 11:40 p.m. and not return for 90 minutes. A man with nothing to hide doesn't respond to an offhand comment about paperwork by disappearing into the dark for an hour and a half. The following week, I found the folder. My mother mentioned, over lunch, almost cheerfully, that Gerald had recommended a lawyer to help simplify her estate now that they were married. I asked to see it. One glance at the beneficiary structure told me what I needed to know without needing a law degree. Nearly everything she owned, including my father's untouched life insurance, routed into Gerald's sole control, with a signing appointment already booked for the following week. I told her I needed a few days. She hesitated before agreeing, and that hesitation, more than anything else, told me how far the conditioning had already gone. That evening, in the kitchen, he found me alone, scotch in hand. Small smile. "You should be careful," he said. "Military boys sometimes forget how the real world works. Poking around in things that aren't your business can have consequences. I'd hate for anything to disrupt how happy your mother finally is." Every sentence built to be deniable. Together, unmistakable. I didn't raise my voice. I held his eyes half a second longer than comfortable and said, "Understood." He read it as retreat. It was the opposite. In my head, I was already doing what any operator does the moment a subject reveals he feels threatened enough to warn you off. I was mapping the terrain. where the exits were, which rooms had a clear line of sight to the driveway, which nights he walked the exterior of the house and which nights he didn't, a habit I'd already logged without meaning to. The same way you log a patrol pattern before you understand yet why it matters. I want to be direct about something, because it's the part of stories like this that usually gets skipped past too fast. I didn't have proof yet. I had pattern matching and instinct, and instinct doesn't hold up in a courtroom. So instead of confronting a man I couldn't yet prove was dangerous, I did something closer to reconnaissance than investigation. I started paying attention to the small, physical, unglamorous details a trained eye catches and an untrained one walks straight past. The mail he intercepted before my mother saw it. The way he angled his laptop screen whenever I entered a room. The specific evenings, always a Tuesday, always a Thursday, when he left for client meetings that never appeared on any calendar my mother had access to. A contact from my time in service, a former Naval Criminal Investigative Service investigator who'd moved into financial fraud work, agreed to run a quiet trace on the name. Within days, a single photograph surfaced, a man who looked 11 years younger than Gerald, but unmistakably him, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize at an industry event in another state, under the name Peter Halverson. That name led to a sealed civil lawsuit filed by the children of a widow named Constance Whitfield Marsh, who had married Halverson 14 months after meeting him at another charity gala, and died 8 months into the marriage of what her death certificate called a cardiac event. The lawsuit had settled quietly. Halverson had vanished afterward. Gerald Ashford had appeared 18 months later in a different state entirely. I sat with that for one night, and one question eclipsed everything else. Constance had died 8 months into her marriage. My mother was 11 months in. If this was a pattern and not a coincidence, the clock wasn't measured in months anymore. Rather than wait on a police process that would need far more than pattern inference to move, I ran a controlled operation of my own. The same discipline I'd used to close in on any unverified threat before committing to contact. I arranged, without explanation, for my mother to spend a weekend at her sister's, removing her from the environment entirely. I made sure Gerald believed nothing had changed, keeping my own routine identical down to the minute, because the fastest way to make a patient predator panic is to let him sense the ground shifting under him too early. While she was gone, my contact traced the money from the sealed Whitfield Marsh settlement through a chain of shell accounts and found it resurfacing, laundered but traceable, in an account belonging to Gerald Ashford. Same money, same man, new name. I brought it to my mother the day she returned, laid across the kitchen table where Gerald had once corrected her stories with a hand on her wrist. She didn't believe me until she saw one photograph, Constance Whitfield Marsh at a gala 8 months before her death, standing beside Peter Halverson, smiling, at an event benefiting the exact same Children's Hospital Foundation where Gerald had met her years later. Same hunting ground, a different woman's face in an identical trap. I watched something in my mother break and reset in the same instant. From there, I stopped operating alone. We moved my mother's frozen accounts through an attorney within 48 hours, quietly enough that Gerald noticed nothing beyond a slightly delayed signing appointment he blamed on paperwork. I fed everything, the identity trail, the laundered funds, the Whitfield Marsh connection, to a detective in the jurisdiction where Constance had died, a case that had been closed for 7 years and reopened within one meeting. But the piece that mattered most, the piece that no financial trail could give us, came from something far simpler. I started sleeping in shifts. 2 hours on, 2 off, the way you do on watch when you don't yet know if the perimeter is secure. On the 4th night of that rotation, at 2:14 in the morning, I heard him. Not the creak of a floorboard, the absence of one. A footstep placed with the kind of deliberate care that told me he already knew which boards to avoid, which meant he'd practiced. He stopped outside my mother's door, not mine. Stood there for 11 seconds. Then continued to the office, and I heard the filing cabinet lock disengage. I didn't move on him that night. Moving too early on an unconfirmed threat is how you lose the larger operation to save yourself a smaller confrontation, and I needed him to lead me to what was in that cabinet more than I needed to satisfy the part of me that wanted to put him on the floor right then. I logged the time. I logged the sound. And the next morning, I quietly photographed, through a 2-inch gap he'd left in his hurry to relock it, a stack of documents inside that cabinet. Insurance paperwork, correspondence with an attorney I didn't recognize, and a folder labeled with initials that weren't my mother's. The exhumation order that followed weeks later, once that photograph reached the detective's desk, is the kind of thing that moves at a pace no operator finds comfortable. Slow, procedural, careful, but it moved. The toxicology panel run on Constance Whitfield Marsh's remains came back with trace markers of a cardiac-inducing compound standard autopsies had never screened for. A 7-year-old wrongful death became an active homicide investigation overnight, and Gerald Ashford went from a man with an unusual employment history to the prime suspect in a murder nobody had thought to question. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning in the driveway, on his way to finalize the exact account transfer we'd already frozen without his knowledge. He didn't resist. Men like him never do, because his weapon was never his hands. It was patience, and patience doesn't fight back once it's finally caught. I stood at the end of that driveway and watched 2 officers guide him into the back of a car, and I felt something far quieter than triumph. The specific, hollowed-out stillness that comes after a threat resolves and your body doesn't yet know it's allowed to stand down. I've felt that stillness before, on the other side of the world, in circumstances nobody at home ever hears about. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like the moment right after you realize everyone is still breathing. My mother came outside barefoot, still in the clothes she'd slept in, and she didn't look at Gerald's car at all. She looked at me, and she crossed that driveway and put her arms around me the way she used to when I was small enough to be lifted off the ground. Except now I was the one holding her weight up, and she said my name once, just my name, like she was confirming to herself that I was actually real and actually standing there and actually hers. We went back inside together, past the hallway where Gerald had quietly exiled every photograph of my father, and my mother stopped there, in front of the wall, and reached out and touched the edge of one frame with 2 fingers, the way you'd touch something you were afraid might not still be solid. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "He would have known. Your dad would have known the first night." I told her I didn't think that was true, that Gerald was good, professionally good, built for exactly this. She shook her head and said, quieter, "No. He would have known, because you knew. And you're half him." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there was one to give. She moved that photograph back to the mantel herself, that same afternoon, before the house had even finished processing what had happened inside it. She stood there a long time looking at my father's face, and I understood, watching her, that the fear she was finally allowing herself to feel wasn't really about the exhumation order, or the sealed lawsuit, or the 8-month pattern that had almost repeated itself in her own kitchen. It was simpler than that. It was the realization, arriving all at once now that it was finally safe to arrive, of exactly how close she had come to becoming a name in someone else's folder. A name nobody would have thought to question. A cause of death nobody would have flagged. A woman remembered, quietly and wrongly, as unlucky. The investigation that followed connected Gerald to at least 2 more identities and at least 2 more women. One who survived him only because she'd run out of money before he finished what he started, and had, in her own words to investigators, no idea how fortunate that made her. My mother's marriage was annulled in a process complicated by the fact that the man she'd married had never legally been the person on the license. She doesn't talk about him much now. When she does, it isn't the threat in the kitchen she returns to. It's smaller than that. It's the fact that for 11 months, she believed someone had finally, truly listened to her, and now has to live with knowing that every second of that listening was a calculation aimed at exactly this outcome. As for the 4 words that started it, "You should be careful," I think about them more than I probably should. He meant them as a warning that would make me back away the way every previous obstacle in his path had backed away. Instead, they told me, with more clarity than any piece of forensic evidence later would, that I had already found the one thread he couldn't afford to have pulled. He looked at a son standing in his mother's kitchen and saw someone he could intimidate into silence. He never once considered that silence, to a man trained the way I was trained, isn't submission. It's the sound of someone deciding, very carefully, exactly how this ends. And that, I think, is the question this story leaves behind long after the arrest, the annulment, and the quiet reopening of a case that had been closed for 7 years. Somewhere tonight, in another kitchen, another version of Gerald Ashford is telling another grieving woman that he finally understands her, And the only thing standing between her and becoming the next sealed settlement, the next name nobody thought to question, is whether anyone in her life happens to be paying close enough attention and trained well enough to notice before the quiet becomes permanent.